Hello everyone, welcome to Microeconomics. This is the introductions sections for these lessons. Well, in these sections, we are going to go over what's different between microeconomic study and the macroeconomic study. And also, we are going to go over some of the basic principles of economics in general. Well, first of all, what is the study of economics? Well, economics is a social science study. Well, it mainly study over the allocations of scarce resources among the unlimited wants from the world. So in short, what it means is the economic study trying to help us to build a foundation or structure to discover the questions for how we should use our resources in general to achieve our goals. Well, there are two main branches of the study of economics. Well, one is microeconomics, and the study of microeconomics is mainly focused on studying the economic model for individual economic agencies, such as individual households, individual firms, or maybe individual industry. Well, compared to microeconomics, the macroeconomic study is focusing more on the aggregate levels of the economic activities, such as GDP, employment, inflations, overall consumptions, import-exports, or maybe the macroeconomic policies. So the scope of the two studies are very, very different. However, I would say, well, these studies are basically complementing each other because there are many foundations of macroeconomic concepts are actually derived from the assumptions of microeconomics. Finally, before we move on to the next slides, I would like to remind you guys that economics is a social science study that's based on modeling. Well, there are theoretical models and empirical models. Well, in this lessons, we are going to focus more on the theoretical parts so that we have a foundation to build upon this study. So later we are going to see in chapter 2 the first model of economics. So we are going to take the time to study how we can break down the complexity of the economic problems into a similar structures that we can actually solve the problems every time the same way. Well, in these lessons, we are going to discover some of the most important principles of economics in general. Well, first of all, well, we have to know that we always bump into the problem of scarcity. So scarce resources, it's one of the greatest problems that we faced. We always scarce by some of the resources we want to use in our life to get what we want. For instance, when we're trying to go to Disneyland, we are trying to achieve a goal. We want to play all the rides, we want to go to all the theme parks. However, time becomes our scarce resources in this case. We want to travel all the theme parks. However, every theme park actually requires you to line up. And because there's so many people lining up in the theme parks, so you have to determine which one you want to go first so that you can get to the one that you wanted the most. And now that is an economic problem. Well, another very intuitive example is we want to also think about how we spend our income, right? When we're trying to get something to eat, well, we have to think about how much of our income should be spent on buying this food. And money in this case becomes a scarce resources. And of course, time and money are very, very general idea of presenting how we face scarcity on everyday life. But there are more general concepts that we can actually generalize in the later lessons of seeing how we define scarcity. Well, we know that we face a scarcity in our life, and now it's very easy to see that when we're trying to achieve something using our scarce resources, obviously we have to give up the use of these resources on other things. For instance, when we try to spend time to study at home for the economic exam tomorrow, obviously we cannot use this time that we study for the economic exam to play video games. So in this case, obviously, when we're trying to find time or spending time to study the economic exam, we have to give up something, which is the time that we can use to play video games. But there are many of this trade-off happen in our life every day. And this trade-off, it's usually what we call the opportunity cost. Well, one definition that you should always keep in mind is the opportunity cost of any actions or any decisions. It's basically the second best alternative you have in your life. Well, for now, you might actually be very vague or maybe not clear about the concept, but don't worry. In Chapter 2, we are going to use the production possibility frontier model to define what we mean by opportunity cost. Well, when we know that we're making a decisions to do something or to achieve something, we have to give up other thing else, then we have to think about what we should do to maximize the outcome. Well, fortunately, there is a general rule that tells us there is one way to get the most out of these decisions, and this concept here is called specializations. Well, we know that everyone has its own talents. Some people might be doing better in computer science. Some people might be better in studying English. When people are doing something that they passions and they are strong at, they can actually specialize in those tasks, and later on they can use what they achieved to exchange with other people that can do best on their own. And this is basically a concept of trade. We know that there is always a gain from trading, so that's why specialization makes our life much better. So a general example would be, if you think about these two people here, one is a hunter and the other one is a farmer. Well, if they are willing to exchange what they do best, so for instance, in this case, the hunter is trading the ham to the farmer in exchange for some corns. Well, both of them will be better off, not because they have both, but it's because both of the people can actually enjoy more of corns and ham at the end of the day. And again, in Chapter 2, we are going to demonstrate this concept. Well, as an economy, we also promote specializations, and we want people to specialize in a task that they do best of and make trade with others so that we can actually keep growing our economy more effectively. When we're making decisions, well, everyone has an incentive to do something or to achieve something. Well, this is a very general concept of economics. Since the study of economics is focusing on making the best decisions to allocate resources, we know people will do something in response to what we call an economic incentives. And most of the time, people thought of the word incentive as a positive outcome. In fact, it's not necessary. Incentive can be both either good or bad. So for instance, I can actually ask the people in the class, if students actually writing an essay on macroeconomic policy, they will all get A in the class. Well, students are going to respond to my suggestions here. Most of the students who wants to get A in this class, they will respond to this incentive. It's a good outcome they can get out so that they will spend time, which is the resources, to achieve this goal and writing me a macroeconomic policy essay. However, if I'm going to give them another order, so for instance, I will give an F to students if any of them actually called their instructor, hey. Oh, okay, so it's a very bad outcome. But again, it's an economic incentive for students to respond. So instructor do not want the student to call them hey. So that's why given this policy, well, students are going to spend the resources. Again, in this case, it's the will of doing something. So they are not going to call the instructor hey. Instead, they will try to call the instructor politely to avoid these bad consequences, which is getting an F in this class. So that's why economic incentive is a very strong policy tool for the government to actually make adjustments to behavior in our countries. So later on, we are going to see some of the policy, how people actually respond to those economic incentive by the policy givens. Well, in general, when people making decisions, we rarely the case to make a decisions based on yes or no. There's always a spectrum of it. So what do we mean by that? So in general, we basically think that most of the people or decision makers in the economy, they actually behave with a marginal decisions. They do not just say yes or no, but more often they will actually evaluate the current condition and trying to ask the questions, should I do one more? Or should I do a little bit extra? Or should I add a bit more additions to my current work? All these little baby steps that people are making or decided to move on is what we call a marginal decisions. Well, the rule of thumbs in economics, it's to make an optimal decision. It's always trying to make a decisions where the marginal benefits equals to the marginal cost. Well, in the later lessons, when we get to the firm decisions of productions, you are going to see how this marginal benefit and marginal cost actually make perfect sense for making optimal decisions for the firm to maximize profits. Well, same for the households. When you are trying to make decisions for yourself, for instance, you want to think about how much time you want to spend more to study for the exam that happens tomorrow. Well, you're also making a marginal decisions at almost every half an hour or maybe every 15 minutes. So we're going to go over this marginal analysis later in the lessons. Well, in general, we believe that when a group of people they are trying to make decisions together and they are going to interact, that will form what we call a market. And in general, a market is usually defined by two groups of people, buyers and sellers. Well, why economists actually buy into the idea of market so much? Well, because in many cases, or theoretically, equilibrium conditions is basically the best solutions we can get out from the markets by itself naturally. Whenever the market is running on its own, there is no imbalance of power in the market, and there is perfect information to every parties in the markets so that everyone can make a rational and informative decisions. Usually it will get to the market equilibrium that drive the optimal solutions or the maximum welfare in the markets. Well, to actually demonstrate that, well, it's very difficult to build a market model right now to demonstrate. I would say, well, you can actually think about your daily life. We always drive our decisions to the optimals or to the equilibrium. So for instance, if you look at this example here, you think of this three lanes of cars that in front of you, and you're driving toward this traffic of car. And there are three cars actually on the left lane, and there are three cars on the right lane. And there are two cars right in the middle lane, and you are driving toward them and you are thinking, which lane should I actually stop? And I believe most of you guys actually know this car will always drive toward this middle lane. The reason is because, well, this middle lane actually has the least car to wait to get past the road. Well, this is basically a conditions we call equilibriums. Well, how do we know it's an equilibrium? Because, well, first of all, this is the best solutions for the driver going toward this traffic. And second of all, if you ask the questions, if I'm going to make these decisions again, facing exactly the same situations, am I going to change my decisions? And obviously, with the conditions set in this way, every time when you're trying to get through the traffic, you're facing this situation, you are going to make exactly the same decisions. Well, no tendency to make changes is one of the basic meaning of equilibrium. So markets always go towards equilibriums, and equilibrium is the best solution that maximizes the welfare for everyone's in the markets, and that's why we love the market equilibrium so much. And indeed, well, this equilibrium is basically driven by what we have studied earlier, which is the economic incentive, because everyone is getting their best solutions from this equilibrium. Well, when we get to the equilibriums, well, we actually say that the market is actually running efficiently. And again, what we mean by efficiency is actually quite vague right now for us to learn. But efficiency can be defined in economics in two ways. One is called the allocation efficiency, while the other way is called the productive efficiency. So later we are going to study both, but for now we just say, well, when the market is running efficiently, then everyone get the most out of it by using the least amounts of resources. Remember, the study of economics, it's all about using our scarce resources to get what we want. If we can minimize the use of our resources to get the maximum amounts of goods and services that we need, then obviously that is the best solutions we can ever ask for. Well, unfortunately, in our society, the world is not like how we described earlier, that simple. So most of the time, we actually have to think about problem other than efficiency. Especially in the study of economics, there's always a question to ask. What about this policy is not fair to some group of people? Well, it's very often happen that when we trying to come up with some policy suggestions as an economist, there will be a conflict between efficiency and equity. Again, well, this is a trade-off in economic decisions. When we getting more and more efficient society, most of the time we have to sacrifice some amounts of equity. So if you think about this, this is basically a resources we have to give up in order to gain more on the other things. So that's why, well, the trade-off between equity and efficiency become a very important and also very challenging topics in the study of economics. We are going to see some example later when we get to the policy discussions. Well, for now, you can actually think about an example like, should we raise taxes on the high-income people in these nations so that we can provide funding for programs that aid the poor people? Well, of course, you can easily see this answer here. Well, if you're rich in this country, you have a very high income, and you'll be taxed extra, then obviously you're probably not going to vote yes on this policy suggestions. However, if you are actually coming from a low income family, you actually stuck with this very low paying jobs, and you have nowhere to go, and you're paying very high rents, obviously you're probably gonna vote yes, and you want to actually make this policy to help improve your life. In general, we're asking a question: is it a fair policy? Right? So, is it fair to rich people? Well, to be honest, this can leave some room for arguments. So that's why, well, in the study of economics, we don't actually say that efficiency means everything, but then we have to always balance the two here. So the trade-off between equity and efficiency, it's always exists, and we have to always try to find the best solutions between the two. Well, like we mentioned before, market usually leads to efficiency, right, when we get to the equilibrium. So the problem is when we are trying to trust on the market economy so much and we believe that people are all going to make the right decisions based on whatever given conditions they have, well, unfortunately, sometimes this can lead to a very bad consequences because sometimes market can fail. There are several reasons why the market might not go towards to the social equilibriums that drive the maximum welfare. List a few. Maybe number one, imbalance informations, right? So when the seller is knowing a little bit more than the buyers and they're trying to trick them to buy something that's not worth that much with a higher price. Or maybe when we have a incompetitive markets, for example, like a monopoly, right? When the firm is so strong and so powerful in the markets that can take over the decisions of how much people needs to pay for the product. So those are the conditions that drive the market's failure and leading the markets not going towards to the desired social optimal equilibrium conditions. Well, traffic conjunctions, it's basically one of the best examples of how people making an irrational choice of going to the roads at the same time. However, when we facing a market failure, we are not panicked to say that we are going towards the end of the world. We actually know that there is a third agent in the market that can actually help improve the conditions. Well, this is basically the job of the government because policy is so strong and so determinant that can drive a different behavior of the firms and consumers in the market. So that's why we can actually depend on the government interventions to make the market adjustments for improving the society welfare from the markets. Like we said earlier before, right, in the traffic conjunction case, maybe the government can implement something like charging a toll fee, maybe subsidizing the cost of the public transportation to make people take more public transportations and less driving, or maybe testing the sales of gasoline, make it more expensive for people to drive. So those are the policy, again, providing the economic incentives to people to make change of the behavior so that we can resolve those social problems in the market setting. Again, we are going to have several examples in the later chapters to demonstrate that. So providing incentives to individual driver is one way to fix the problem through the government interventions. Well, generally speaking, not only in the micro foundations problems set up, we have the policy to engage. Sometimes when we're facing a more serious economic problems like depressions or maybe recessions or high inflation periods, we also depend so much on the governments to make change of the markets. And those kind of policy, it's what we call the macroeconomic policy. And sometimes those policy has a much more strong incentive to implement than the local microeconomic markets policy solutions. So that's why studying the policy, it's a very important, and economic study actually provide a very good frameworks for us to understand how it works. And lastly, but not last, we have been seeing our countries or maybe our families, right, even to grow in or to make a better living in the past decades of life. Obviously, all this wealth generated in the nations or maybe in your family, it's not just by the people working very hard in the countries. In fact, we believe there are two fundamental driving forces that drive the wealth of nations towards a higher level. Well, one is through the good structure of institutions. So that means, well, a legal system that can enforce contract and laws to protect the rights of the citizens and also the ideas that they create, so that it protect businesses to earn incomes. Well, another driving force would be the ideas or maybe the creativities of the citizens to create new products, to create new ways to produce goods and services in a more effective ways. So those ideas and creativity, or in general, we call this innovations, actually is one of the main driving force that create that wealth of nations in the United States. And that's why we have been seeing our family growing in better living quality year by years. Well, lastly, in the chapter, we actually have a discussions about why sometimes economists might disagree with others. To give examples, to be honest, the main reasons why economists agree with each other, it's mainly because they are answering different questions, right? So there are some questions that economists do not disagree with each other, and those kind of economic question is called the positive economic questions. Those are the questions that we can prove by facts or maybe just calculate it, and there is only one definite answer and cannot be argued. So sometimes you can think about positive economic questions like how many people are in a room, right? So you can actually count how many people are sitting in a room and given a number to answer these questions. And everyone in the room should actually have the same answer. And that kind of question is what we call a positive economic questions. However, there are some economic questions, it's what we call the normative economic questions. Well, the normative economic questions are the one that base off the point of view or beliefs of the people that might actually drive a different answer from one to another. So not everyone should have the same answer to those kind of questions. So for instance, you can think of like a normative questions be like something like you go out with a group of friends and you ask your friends how well you dress today, right? So some of your friends might think that you are dressing very trendy today, or maybe some of your other friends might think that you have a very, very bad taste. You cannot say that other people are wrong because it's really based upon how they judge your dress or maybe your appearance and where they come from, so what kind of cultural backgrounds, how they feel fashions, and how well they know about fashions, right? So there is no one definite answer to those questions, and that's basically what we mean by normative economic questions. So when we are trying to answer some normative economic questions, such as, should we provide more equity society or efficiency society? Okay, so remember the trade-off between equity and efficiency. Well, this is exactly the questions that we answer in the normative economics. Those kind of questions can be very, very difficult to answer. It's very challenging to answer, and also no one has a definite answer to those questions. And that's why it's very easy for economists to disagree with each other on those kind of questions. Well, finally, the chapter wrap up with some vocabulary to learn, so I would strongly recommend you guys to go back to the chapter reading and trying to study those vocabularies or terminologies covered in this chapter. And I am very excited to see you guys next week for the chapter 2 discussions. Goodbye.